Hey there guys, Noah here, and welcome back to another Vanguard discussion video. In this video, I want to answer a question that's been at the back of my mind lately. What works best for Vanguard tournaments? Best of 1, best of 3, or team competitions? Considering I've been participating in a lot of tournaments throughout this year, I like to think I know what I'm talking about. I will be going over the pros and cons, as well as what these events look like in practice, and I'll be using both Bushiroad events like Springfest and BCS, as well as unofficial events such as the Kingslayer Invitational Series to make my points. Lastly, I'll be taking all three formats, those being Standard, V, and Premium, into account on my decisions. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, leave a like, comment down below, and consider subbing to the channel because any bit of support is greatly appreciated. Without further ado, let's get into it. So let's start with Best of 1, because this one doesn't need nearly as much explaining as the other two. Best of 1s usually have a structure of a single match, and the match usually has a timer that's anywhere between 25 to 30 minutes before end turn procedures depending on the event. These matches usually go by pretty quickly, and as a result of this, most Best of 1 singles events usually have anywhere from 6 to 8 rounds on average, depending on the size of the event as well as the format played. So there's already a massive issue that doesn't become apparent to many people who don't play in these kind of events. So let's break this down. So let's say that we have enough people for the full 8 rounds. Now right off the bat we run into our first issue with this setup, which is the overall length of the event. Even if every single player plays quickly, the event in question could run it from early in the morning into early evening, which, by the way, there would be no breaks in between rounds to go out and grab something to eat because, well, let's be frank, Bushiroad ever since
Bermuda 90
has stopped this practice outright, simply to make sure the tournaments run smoother and at a reasonable pace. This is before we even get to top 8, which, depending on deck checks as well as any other possible issues that might come up that are beyond the player's control, could lead this event to run for another 2 hours or at most, depending on the circumstances. Needless to say, this is a lose-lose situation, and this is even before I even get into discussing how the tournament structure in question affects the player's decisions round by round. As the player going through this gauntlet of a tournament, they honestly can't afford to lose even more than once if they want to guarantee a spot in top 8, which, depending on a lot of variables such as the nation or clan they play, among many other things, is incredibly hard to pull off consistently, which, when you put everything I've mentioned into consideration, to simply put it, you're gonna have a bad time. Unless you're playing one of the best decks in the format, or you know every single matchup and can literally play into the meta well enough, your chances of making it far are sometimes slim to none. Even if you make it far, you'll start to run into everyone's biggest issue when it comes to the length of this event, which is you are prone to making mistakes, because simply put it,
we're all exhausted.
They are only human, Dr. Tesla. Unfortunately.
Even if you luck sack through most of the rounds, fatigue will come back and bite you so damn quick in the ass that you are bound to make misplays toward the end of the event. To me and a lot of other people, this is the hardest part about playing in these Best of 1 events. Keeping your head straight through most of this carnage, especially when you go through everything else into consideration. Yeah, it's a fucking train wreck. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I can definitely say without a shadow of a doubt that single Best of 1s are my least favorite way to play this game competitively. Luck plays too much of a factor because human error is commonplace in large events like this, and if the triggers won't kill you, the exhaustion will. Up next is Best of 3 singles. These consist of a set that's won when one player has gotten 2 wins against their opponent. These sets usually last anywhere from 40 minutes to an hour depending on the event. However, due to these sets taking longer to complete, a tournament with this kind of setup will only have an average of 4 to 6 rounds depending on the format and player turnout. So right out the gate, we have a lot of things to go over.
Yeah, no shit, Sherlock!
Starting with the fact how in a best of 3 there's a lot more to go into the thought process when tackling a match in comparison to a best of 1. Because there's a possibility that 3 games are going to be played,
I beg your pardon?
both players will get an idea of what each other's deck does in general throughout the entire set, assuming that they don't already know the matchup by that point. This makes the possibility of getting luck sacked out of a win not as likely, as even if they early aggro you into submission on game 1, you can mentally prepare for the worst going into game 2 and possibly game 3, provided you're able to adapt to what your opponent's doing, thus allowing the player who can naturally play better into the matchup to do better overall in the event, and as a result, makes the event more skill-based. However, there is one major caveat to this, and that is, If the set goes past the 1 hour mark and goes into time, then chances are that that current game that they're playing turns into a who's gonna drop dead first situation. Either that or it becomes a war of attrition. Allow me to go into further detail. If a game goes into time in a best of 3, whoever's turn it is will start the end of turn procedures as turn 0. When their turn ends, the opponent will start turn 1, and they go back and forth until the end of turn 3. In which case, if neither side has won yet, judges will compare damage to see who has more, and whoever actually has more damage loses. If both players have the same damage, then this can go either one of two ways. In one instance, both players will get a loss and it becomes a double loss, which ultimately hurts their score and any chance that they realistically have in making it into top 8. The second way is both players play it out until somebody takes another damage. Now, of course, this is assuming that end of turn procedures actually start on game 3 and you're not still stuck in game 1 or 2. Regardless, it could change how both players go into the remainder of this set, knowing that because they took too long to wrap up games 1 and 2, they suddenly find themselves in a more dire situation from that point on. They either have to play extremely carefully to avoid losing, which that in itself applies a lot of mental pressure, or hope and pray that their final 2 turns will be enough to clinch them the set. In either case, it's not fun. This entire situation can be avoided if you pay closer attention to time, but you also run the risk of adding additional pressure to yourself by doing this. Sometimes players can just find themselves into time and it'll come out of nowhere, and as a result, they'll start making bad calls and bad plays in general that inevitably costs them the set because they feel pressured. There's one last thing I should probably mention before I move on to my personal thoughts on this tournament structure. If you want to get a better feel for what the meta is going to be like going into a best of 1 event, then usually 9 times out of 10, best of 3 results usually give a solid picture on what's consistently topping at events, simply due to the skill cap that actually goes into each set. Best of 3s are a lot more stressful and strategic overall, however I know it's not for everyone, but currently this is the way how I prefer to play, and many wish that Bushiroad would adapt this kind of tournament structure into one of their tournament series, but let's look at this from a completely different angle before we write off best of 1s completely. Finally, we have team events, otherwise known as Team League. These are tournaments that have teams of 3 competing against each other in 1v1 matches simultaneously. Each team member has to play a different deck, so for example, you can't have 2 Nirvana players in Standard on the same team, and you can't have 2 Narukami players on the same team in V and Premium. The rounds last for a total of 25 minutes per round, and the team that gets 2 wins out of the 3 games wins the set. However, if both teams have won 1 match each, and it goes into time, you will then go into the end of turn procedures. Then if both players end all 3 turns and they have the same damage, then they go into sudden death, and whoever takes the next damage loses. Then, if both players still have the same damage after the 10-minute mark, then both teams get a double loss. Right away you can see that because each player has to play a different deck, the metagame for these team events can be quite varied. As you can see from a recent team event in Japan, while there tends to be one outlier, this one being Youthberg, the rest of the decks used by the players can be quite diverse as a result of each team having to play 3 separate decks. If we take the results from one of the last Spring Fests from this year, we could see that this is even more varied and quite unique. The 3 most represented decks at the time being Order Colony, Chaos, and Kagero, with the remaining decks being completely different from each other. I'm aware there's going to be some little Timmy out there that tries to argue, well, just because you have a lot of representation, it doesn't mean that there's any skill that goes into team building. To that I say,
you stupid.
Let's start with the fact that there's some metas where there's an obvious best deck that can't be beat. For the most part, as long as the players can play around that and know how their specific build matches up against it, then 9 times out of 10 they'll be fine. A common misconception when it comes to these kind of events is that the best decks will either be playing as player A or C depending, just simply to get an advantage, quote unquote. This is completely false, as due to the randomness of what each team could bring to a tournament, there's no easy way to predict what the decks will be 100% of the time for player A, B, or C. For example, player A can play the best deck in the format, while player B can play the next best deck in the format, while player C plays the anti-meta pick. Since these roles can be swapped and arranged around in any order they see fit, usually it doesn't matter. As a result of this, what this really comes down to is that, at the end of the day, that in a team event, player knowledge and how that person fares against the opponent across from them is vital for them doing well at all. The best part about these team leagues is that even if you screw up, your teammates can pick up the slack and nab the 2 other wins needed to win the set overall. thus not hurting your record. This obviously has its pros and cons for sure, but what I think this ultimately comes down to is that people actually tend to enjoy these events way more than a BCS, simply due to the fact that it's a team effort. And as a result, when you do well, it's more satisfying than one person might actually think. And this is why personally I prefer in a best of one tournament to play with 2 other people rather than by myself. I think overall there's no right or wrong way for competitive events to be run, because it's usually a matter of personal taste and what each person in general would want out of their Vanguard experience. Even outside of a competing aspect, it's a ton of fun going to a major event because you get to interact with people that you normally wouldn't outside of one. And I highly encourage anybody who's new to the game that isn't entirely sure if they want to go to a Springfest or BCS, definitely do so, because it's honestly a ton of fun. Especially when you go with people that you know from your locals or even just a small group of friends in general. So now I'm curious, what's your take on this topic? What's your favorite way to play this game for a competitive event? Let me know in the comments section. Until next time, this is Noah, and I'll catch you guys later. Bye-bye.